Good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome to our latest Fellow in Focus event. My name is Ciarán O'Neill. I'm Deputy Director of Trinity Longroom Hub, which is Trinity's flagship Arts and Humanities Research Institute. And it's my job today to introduce the Fellow in Focus, Dr. Carly Keogh, who's sitting to my right here. Carly's with us for a couple of months, and at long last, after a 2-year COVID-induced delay, but we're delighted to have her here and excited to see what work is emerging. So Carly is the Canada Research Chair in Atlantic Canada Communities at St. Mary's University in Nova Scotia in Canada. Previously worked at the University of the Highlands and the Islands and Glasgow Caledonian in Scotland. She researches religious minority migration and settler colonialism in the North Atlantic world. She's convener of the Scottish Historical Review Trust, a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, and chairperson and academic lead of the Goresbrook Research Institute for Atlantic Canada Studies. She's just published her second monograph, which I can wave at you all here, Empire and Emancipation, Scottish and Irish Catholics at the Atlantic Fringe, 1780 to 1850. It was published in February, so very recently, just a couple of months ago, by Toronto University Press. And while at Trinity, she's going to be working on a project called the Catholic Atlantic, and this is a project which I'm involved with as well, and it explores the links between Scotland, Ireland, the Caribbean, and northeastern British North America, so what we now call Atlantic Canada, broadly speaking. So welcome, Carly. Delighted to have you here. Looking forward to this chat. The format's very simple. I'm going to ask questions for about half an hour or so, and then open to the floor and to our audience online. The event is being streamed live on Facebook, and it will thus be recorded. If audience members would like to ask a question, that's great. We very much encourage you to do so, whether online or here with us in person. So if online, please just do use the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen. As with everything in the Hub, we want our audience to participate and to be involved, so please do feel free to interact with us during the event. So, my first question to you is about your kind of research journey to date. More than most researchers that I know, your own research agenda seems to sort of mirror your life and your personal journey through education. I'm kind of hoping you'll start us off by talking through your journey from rural Cape Breton through to Halifax and on to Glasgow, where you ended up doing a PhD on women religious, which eventually became your first book, Creating a Scottish Church. How did all that happen?
Well, thank you. When I was doing my undergrad, so I was actually supposed to do Irish studies at university, because the university that I went to, St. Mary's, was the only place in Atlantic Canada that offered Irish studies, so I was committed to that. But then I got there and I got distracted and I got interested in other things. But I didn't lose focus on the Irish dimension for my honors, and I looked at Irish female migration. And then I got an opportunity in my 4th year to go on exchange to the University of Glasgow and started to see evidence of an awful lot of migration across to Scotland. And I didn't know this coming from Canada. I didn't realize the connections. I also didn't realize that in Canada, the relationship between Scotland and Ireland is always sort of painted as very close. But then when you look at the relationship between Irish and Scottish Catholics, when you get to Scotland, you realize that it wasn't actually close in any way. And so that was really interesting to me. And I decided to stay on at Glasgow for my PhD and look at Irish female migrants. And I quickly realized the only place where I could get really interesting, genuine primary source material that wasn't printed were in convent archives. And so I just started researching women religious kind of by accident, because I followed the source material, not because I had any intention to do Catholic history. And then realized I think because I was female, because I was developing knowledge, I started to get access to a lot of collections that other people maybe weren't able to access. And it was the foundation of my first book. And it was an interesting time because Catholic history wasn't really being done in Scotland. I'm not sure how many people are aware of the situation over there, but it really wasn't in vogue. But I came from a place where Catholicism was really part of the Scottish migrant story, and I was curious about, well, how come Scottish migrants would identify strongly as Catholics where I come from in Nova Scotia or Atlantic Canada, but over here, Catholics are seen as not part of the Scottish nation. and I didn't understand that. And so that was a big question that I addressed with my PhD and then my first book. So creating a Scottish church was all about trying to understand how the Catholics in Scotland were adjusting and trying to paint themselves into this story of the nation where they belonged, but had been excluded from.
So, I'm gonna, I mean, your research since has kind of evolved to think sort of outward into the empire. I'm going to ask you that in a minute, but I want to stick with you this topic of Catholic history for a minute, because, you know, I first came across your work and knew you as a historian of Catholics and Catholicism, if you like, but one who focused on, you know, issues of gender, and but also as on embattled minority Catholic populations, either in Scotland and then later in imperial contexts. And of course, sitting here in Ireland as we are, being a historian of Catholics can have a sort of different feel to it. You know, it's not a minority, it's a majority, and so on. And we're, you know, at this moment experiencing or witnessing a widespread decline in practice and contestation of church authority in public life. So it's clear that our relationship with the Catholic Church is changing in the Irish context. And so I wanted to ask you, in your sort of 20-odd years researching in the area of Catholics and Catholicism and Catholic experience, what changes are you seeing emerging in researching this area, and what sort of work still remains to be done? What are you excited about at the moment?
I'm excited about a lot more PhDs are starting to happen in Catholic history, at least in Scottish universities that I'm aware of. And when I was doing my PhD over 20 years ago, I was the only one. And I remember there was myself and a colleague who studied Margaret Thatcher, and we were sort of seen as the weirdos because I was the one who did nuns and he was the one who did Thatcher, and we kind of sat by ourselves. But I think there's been more of a willingness to engage with a broader picture of what Scotland is like. But then also when you move across the ocean to Canada, there's more of a curiosity and a need to understand the role that the church played in creating civil society, participating in the structures of colonialism that ultimately led to where we are today, which is dealing with a legacy that is quite damaging. And so I think there's a curiosity and an open-mindedness to say, okay, we now need to start looking into this and we need to have serious research. And it isn't just within the realm of practicing Catholics. It has to be done by historians who are trained as historians and can be dispassionate and get access to the material and then start to share that.
So trying to take Catholic history out of what can be sometimes quite a niche kind of environment and make it more of a mainstream.
Yeah, and that has to happen. You also have to dilute the thinking. You have to start bringing in different ideas and different experiences to look at a topic in new ways. I think one of the reasons why I was able to do what I did in Scotland was because I wasn't from there, and so I didn't have community ties, and I was able to kind of navigate maybe tricky situations without actually knowing I was in the middle of them to begin with. Sectarianism is one.
Yeah, so sometimes being a sort of an outsider and asking the question no insider would ask can be a real asset in the archival process.
Yeah, it was really helpful. Oh,
Yeah.
Bless the Canadian, look at that stupid question.
Yeah, well, I understand. I'd like to have a chat about your latest book. So it's just out of University of Toronto Press. It's called Empire and Emancipation, Scottish and Irish Catholics at the Atlantic Fringe. So the first question is a very basic one for people who haven't read it yet. How do you define the Catholic Fringe or the Atlantic Fringe? What does that mean to you?
So when I was researching this book, when I started it a while ago, what started to pop up in the materials, the archives and libraries, were pretty significant Catholic populations that were old Catholic populations, large Catholic populations in certain parts of the Atlantic world. So I started to see places like Cape Breton and Nova Scotia. They were two separate colonies at the time. Trinidad, different colonies or territories in the Caribbean, Newfoundland, of course, Prince Edward Island. These were all colonies that had sizable Catholic populations before major migration started to happen. Many of those populations were actually French, Spanish, enslaved people, and then Irish and Scots started to come in. And I was really curious about those kind of unfashionable parts of the empire that people they tend to overlook, but particularly when you think of the American Revolution, northeastern British North America became really, really important for the British Empire. And so the people that were populating those colonies became really important, and a number of those people were Catholics. They were Irish and Scottish Catholics.
So what changes about our understanding of that moment, 1780 to about 1850, if we look at it from the position of these so-called sort of peripheral Catholics in unfashionable parts of the empire? How does it change the picture for us? What changes?
I think from my perspective and what I've seen, there was far more of an ability to advocate for rights and to push the boundaries of citizenship. So we get participation, particularly of Irish Catholics in Nova Scotia and Cape Breton, very early, and then claiming a space of within the colony, almost saying, we are here just like you, we need equal representation, we need rights. By the way, we're also fueling your economy, so this is what we feel we're entitled to. I didn't see that, for example, in Scotland. And I think they also recognized that that they could actually apply the label Britain to themselves or British to themselves, and it was going to get them a long way. And it was going to get them privileges that they could never have accessed at home. And then there are consequences of that for Indigenous peoples, for example.
So one of the really interesting things about your book is it sort of takes two or three fields that aren't always in conversation with each other and sort of forces them into interaction. So when I was reading, I was really thinking about Scottish and Irish settler colonials at the margin of empires. These are people who are coming along, settling on fairly large plots of land, much larger than what many of them would have come from. And taking an active generational kind of part in the British Empire or any other empire that would give them land at any one time. And so that brings, especially in the Irish context, you into conflict with the overarching narrative of Irish diaspora, which is that the push factor is more important than the pull factor. But your book's all about pull factor. It's all about the possibility for Irish Catholics or Highland Scots who are being, pushed out of their own traditional territories. It's all about the pull factor that brings them into the empire. Yeah, how does that change the picture of Scottish and Irish history?
So it's a really complicated picture. I think that is starting to emerge. Where I come from in Nova Scotia, the idea of the cleared Highlander is pervasive, and people are very attached to that narrative. It's a little bit difficult when you then walk up to them and say, right, well here are the land grants that your people asked for, demanded in fact. This is how long they've had them. Many of them are still on the land. There was an active process of colonialization or colonization that your people participated in. That changes things a little bit. It's harder to constantly then say, we were forced out, things happened to us. And I think that that's true when you're in the home nation. But then when you look in the colonies and the territories, it's really different. And they were very active in perpetrating dispossession of Indigenous peoples, but also expanding the authority of the British state. Like, it worked in their interests.
Yeah.
So that's something that I see. And sometimes the groups that I study, and the Irish Catholics are the same in the place where I'm of that background. So my background is Acadian, which is a kind of French Canadian, but Acadian from the east, and then Irish. And so my people were in various ways involved in that process.
It's worth kind of sticking on that for a moment, because we've seen from your research journey from Cape Breton through Halifax into Glasgow, and now having moved back to Halifax, and back to Nova Scotia, you're now working on a project where you're analysing Cape Breton as a colony, as it transferred from being a Mi'kmaq Indigenous held piece of land to one that was actively settled by people that you descend from. So all of a sudden you're having to confront your own positionality in relation to the process of settler colonialism in a very direct way. What's that changing about your research process? What's that like to undergo?
It's really hard. It's hard because you don't want to mess it up, because there's a lot of sensitivities, rightly so, and you don't want to do any more damage than what's already being done. And I think positionality is really important, because if you have to walk into a room and say to your family, to your friends, to your community, that we have to rethink things. It's a lot easier for me to walk into my home community and say that, and then say, and I do too, particularly because I come from us. And I think that's something that we in Canada need to be willing to do. But it is hard, and I do worry often, am I getting it wrong? How am I getting it wrong? Or what do I need to do to be more aware of, how do I, for example, understand a need for the Indigenous knowledge? And how can I incorporate that when I don't even know where to start to access it, because I don't come from those traditions.
Yeah. So how to set up a dialogue that is respectful of the power imbalance and hierarchy down to the present as well. Yeah, and again, something you didn't, I mean, you talked about the great benefit of being the outsider in Glasgow, being able to sort of inveigle your way into convent archives because of that, but this is a different level of baggage to bring into your topic.
Yeah.
Really interesting.
And it's shaping Canadian politics right now. And so there's a big responsibility that comes with this research.
So I'm going to come back a little bit to the question of activism and sort of activism in your research towards the end, but I wanted just to think about the project that you're doing right now and the way that connects, you know, from your sort of home territory, Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, down to the Caribbean, and you've been working on Trinidad, Grenada, Dominica for some years now, and you're starting to think about Guyana and various other places in that sort of greater Caribbean, and particularly, let's call it the unfashionable Eastern Caribbean. How does the empire look differently, and the Catholic Empire look differently when you take a Caribbean perspective as opposed to an Atlantic Canadian or an Irish or Scottish or British?
It looks really, really different, partly because the majority of the people were enslaved. And what I've seen and we've seen in our research is that the church is very active in working with the British state to enable itself to retain control. And so it's making decisions and sacrifices about its own authority that it wouldn't normally make to maintain a connection and kind of a foothold in those places. Trinidad is a really good example. And we see it in how the first bishops were kind of, not the first bishops, but after Britain acquired Trinidad, how the bishops were selected. And the British government wanted English bishops. And then when it ran out of English bishops, because people didn't want to go to Trinidad, it was seen as a place where you could like die because of the disease. Then they kind of settled for Irish, not because they wanted them, but because they were available. And so you're seeing how the power structures in the empire are playing out on the ground through the Catholic Church. And the British state was paying for chapels, it was paying for vestments, it was paying for priests' houses and schools. Like it was a partnership.
Building Catholic infrastructure, essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah, in a way that just wouldn't have tolerated in the home context.
Yeah, they were paying for the Eucharist. Like, if that was mentioned in Britain, that like transubstantiation was one of the really big problems for many in Britain in terms of the Protestant belief.
What's the kind of social spread of Catholics that you're seeing in a place like Trinidad? I mean, you know, are we talking about middle class, elite? Are we talking about people who are, you know, opportunists, sojourners, merchants? What's the mix of people that you're finding in your research?
All of them. And most of my experience in this would come from the Scottish dimension, and we're finding that all classes, all groups are represented there. And so you can't say it's just an endeavor of the elite, because every single group of people is represented there.
So, I mean, your research is kind of changing the Irish and Scottish narrative about colonialism, and there's a very different story in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, as compared to Trinidad, where there's a competition and a distribution across different empires and so on. How do you think your work changes the way we think about British Empire, in a sense? Does it have something new to say about British imperialism in the Caribbean and so on?
Yeah, Catholics were part of it, a big part of it. So when you talk about Britain as a Protestant empire, that's wrong. It's factually incorrect, because you have constituencies that are now being highlighted as active participants in the process. You have people that are Scottish Catholic, and their entire, as far as they can count back, they identify as Catholics, and then there's a change in government and suddenly they're not part of it. That doesn't work. So that's what we're seeing. Protestant Empire doesn't work when you start looking at other groups.
Right. So, I mean, I'm excited to see what comes from that, and it's interesting to see how it's developing, beyond, but the threads are still evident in the book that you've just published, I think, of all of these things. But it seems that your new work has to take account of Indigenous and enslaved perspectives in a way that maybe the book that's just out had started to do, but this is an evolution. Is that one of the major changes you think in the work you're doing right now here at the Hub?
Yeah, absolutely. I see that book as a foundation. It enabled me to create a foundation that I can now use to start looking more in depth at colonial structures. And I can't provide an enslaved or an Indigenous perspective. I'm not capable of that. But what I can do is start to make space for it and recognize that this is an area that we need to explore and we need to deal with. And that's where collaboration and partnerships come in. But it's also hard because when you want, and you need to include, for example, an Indigenous perspective, your whole way of researching has to change because a European method of research doesn't gel with the story of an Indigenous experience. It's a completely different way of knowing. And that's something I'm learning.
Okay. Yeah, great. So in the last section, before we go over to kind of audience questions, I just wanted to talk to your own activism, your sort of academic activism in two areas. One, I want to talk about your work with rural communities, which I see as a sort of a through line all the way through your time in academia, from your work in the Highlands through to your current work at SMU Nova Scotia. And secondly, I want to talk about how you work with scholars at risk in the humanities and how you see your historical work on migrants, in historical context, as being very relevant to the present day picture. And so first, your work with communities. Why is that important to you, and why is it important to do?
So my very first academic job was with the University of the Highlands, and it was with the Centre for History in Dornoch, which is up in Sutherland. And the person who hired me was a man named Jim Hunter, and he is a really influential thinker and writer when it comes to Highland history and land and community development. And he hired a bunch of us, there were 5 of us, and we were all early career, and he just said, build a history department, and by the way, go out into the communities. And so we did, because we also did, it was kind of neat, because we didn't have senior scholars telling us what we couldn't do, so we just did really neat things, and we did whatever we wanted. And one of those things was building partnerships with local communities. And I, when I was doing my PhD, I had worked with West of Scotland secondary schools in disadvantaged areas. And so I recognized that, it would be probably really good if I worked with local school pupils. Also because one of my first projects was looking at the links between the Highlands and enslavement in the Caribbean. And one of the schools that was still operating, Renesse Royal Academy, had a cabinet of records from the 18th century. And so what an amazing opportunity to work with the senior pupils with material in their own school to figure out what the student cohort looked like, where they came from, what they studied, and it was a wonderful project. And then the students themselves started to see why they mattered and why their communities, why it was important to look into the past of their communities. And one of the things I remember one of the students saying was, wow, they were way more diverse than we are today, because they had students coming in from a number of Caribbean islands. And so they were able to see these things. And that just continued. It was just something that I did. Worked out well because of REF, but it was just something that I did. And I think that as an academic who is funded by the public, or in part funded by the public, we shouldn't have the luxury of just sitting in our offices. We do have a social responsibility, and we do, for also the survival of the humanities, we have to demonstrate why it matters, and we actually need to take that into the communities. We shouldn't wait for someone to tell us to do that. That's my perspective. I know that it's not easy to just trudge out into communities in whatever form they take and start doing things, but we have to.
I've heard you talk about universities as sites of exclusion, in different contexts. I mean, so when you went back to your sort of home university where you started, SMU Halifax, how did you confront that idea of universities as sites of exclusion? What happened with that?
Well, so when I was growing up, I'd never met anybody who'd gone to university. I'd met people who'd gone to university, but nobody ever came to my school from a university except recruiters, because they wanted our money, but they didn't want to work with us. And so there was a colleague of mine in the English department, Alexander McLeod, and we're both from a rural community in Cape Breton, and we thought, well, why don't we build a program for local high schools where we spend 2 hours once a week for 12 weeks and build a project with them. And so it was an 8-hour drive once a week to very rural Nova Scotia to work with the students and to say, we actually think you're really important, we think your communities are really important, we're not here to recruit you, we're here to actually work with you and get you thinking about high-level humanities research. And it was good. It's also like when you come from a small community, like you need to be committed to that community going forward. Hopefully you don't just disappear. But the rural world, I think, gets excluded often, partly because the population isn't there. But people like the rural world for a number of reasons. But if nobody's there, if nobody stays, then we've got a problem. I mean, food insecurity is one of them.
Yeah. So I wanted to just think about your work on migrants and migration, and think about how that connects up to your work with scholars at risk, right? So it seems that you're really interested in migration, really in a holistic sense. Like, how has one impacted the other?
Yeah, so this is interesting, and it's a big part of what I do. In 2015, I was invited to a workshop in Amsterdam because of the significant numbers of migrants that were entering Europe. And so an organization brought together a bunch of different academics from a range of fields, like medics to history to engineers to physicists, whose work in some way touched on migration. And at the time, I was the co-chair of the Young Academy of Scotland. And I, you know, when you go to those conferences and everybody's really smart in the room, but you're like, nothing's going to happen from this, because everybody keeps talking, but there's nothing practical that's going to come out of this. So on the flight home, I remember thinking the role that I had in Scotland at the time kind of gave me a little bit of an ability to implement a program with the Royal Society of Edinburgh, which was to enable displaced academics in Scotland to become members of the Young Academy of Scotland, which is an elite organization, and there would be no way for colleagues to gain access without a program. And it started in 2016. It's been one of the most successful they've had. And then I was in an organization, the Global Young Academy, and I co-founded the same thing, and I'm now president of the Royal Society of Canada's College, and we're doing the same thing. It's like when you deal with a topic like migration, and the world I understand is academia, so the colleagues that I could advocate for from a position of truth were other academics who were forced to leave their home countries. And so also working with those colleagues has taught me a lot about the process of migration for somebody who's displaced. Because you see people who are your friends experiencing this, and often I feel powerless. But I think that shouldn't stop us from doing things.
Right, and from changing institutions from within, which seems to be a big thing with you. I mean, as in, a lot of your work has happened within what are quite classically sort of elite structures. Is that the best place to do this work?
It's the place where you can get really serious awareness and traction, because it brings together representatives from a lot of institutions. So there are a lot of colleagues working at their own home institution to try to find placements or provide space or support. But when you deal with something like a national academy or society, you actually are able to let a lot of university leaders know about a problem and then ask them to help. I have not faced any pushback from any of those organizations. They have all been 100% supportive of me. And I wasn't sure that was going to be the case. But even now with the Royal Society of Canada, everybody has been, how can we help? Rather than, oh, I don't know that we can do that, right? And yeah, those structures have to change. And so I kind of had an ability to work within them.
Okay, no, great. It's good to hear that it is possible. And this brings me to my last question before I go over to the audience. I know you've been actively involved from your time in Scotland with work around slavery and legacies of slavery and colonialism in institutions and universities, because you've done this work in Scotland and now have been involved in conversations in Halifax with Dalhousie, who did a big report on their slave legacies and their colonial legacies a few years ago that I know you were involved with. What's your sense of whether or why that work is important? And I say that from a Trinity point of view because we're currently thinking about those things ourselves.
Yeah, I think it is really important, partly because we bring in students, we're supposed to bring in students from all groups, from all around the world. The institutions, as they've been built up, have been built up in wonderful ways, in problematic ways, in painful ways. I think it's important that we recognize all of those, and that we also start to be honest about what are the connections. Who funded that building, by the way? And you can walk around all the universities not all the universities, but a number of the older universities in the UK, and you can link many of them to money that came from the empire. And it's not just the Caribbean, right? You can point to India, you can point to North America. And I think it's part of the process of creating a more healthy narrative that makes space for people to feel like they can belong somewhere. I mean, as a woman, I will walk around a university, if I see paintings of a lot of men, it doesn't really make me feel like it's a place that I belong. But if there starts to be a conversation about changing that, then all of a sudden I can feel part of that conversation. And I wouldn't want our students in Ireland, Scotland, or Canada to ever feel that they don't have a place in our universities or colleges.
Okay, that's great, really interesting. So now's the point at which I sort of go over to the floor and to our online audience and see what great questions will come from there as opposed to from our conversation. So I have a question here at the back. Yeah, please, go ahead.
Thanks very much for that. One quick question first. You mentioned going to university to do Irish studies and then you got distracted. But what was the impetus, first of all, to do Irish studies? Or was it your background and that? And the other thing I was really interested in what you're talking about with the schools and how you were engaging the schools. And we're talking about responsibilities, and I was wondering how you saw the role of public history in changing the narrative and actually, bringing different voices to the story. And obviously the schools is one very interesting way of perhaps changing at a certain age, but I wonder if you have any other thoughts on that.
Yeah, so the first question, Irish studies, I was sort of, it was my background, and it was I think something my family was really keen on, so then I was like, yeah, okay, that's what I'll do. And then I got there and got to make my own choices, and history was pretty fun. But in terms of the public history, I think it's really, really important. And I think that there's a growing interest. Certainly in Canada, we have a number of public history programs that are starting to emerge, even in my own department, because there's a real keenness from the students to have experiences that are beyond the classroom. So a lot of the courses that we're developing include partnerships with different organizations that are around Halifax or Cape Breton or wherever. But even when I was in Scotland, there was a lot of interest in partnering, and then students participating in that partnership and seeing how they can work beyond the academy and how their research can actually matter at a practical level. One thing I'm a little worried about with PhDs at the moment is when they leave, they think that the only thing they can do is work in a university, and their skill set is so diverse that it would be really great if we did more to help them integrate into other employment sectors, partly because other employment sectors want critical thinkers, partly because wouldn't it be great if we could have a real range of highly trained professionals that can just apply really neat ideas, and also have an understanding of the need for culture and heritage preservation and interpretation.
The more PhDs, the better. That's great. Yeah. Okay. On.
Thank you so much. It's really something I was looking forward to a lot. I had two questions. The first one, I really appreciated what you said about wanting to go into a space and knowing that you can never represent the perspectives or the experiences or the knowledge, the tacit knowledge from people who are from migrant backgrounds, but how do you practically hold space for that within your research? How are you practically making space for that within the academy? So that's my first question. My second question is about the rural background. I feel really, really deeply connected to this as well, being from a rural place, and also not meeting a lot of people who went to university and then being the one to go. And you never want to let that make you separate from the community that you came from, and then you feel like you have a responsibility to be that bridge. So from your own experience, when you're going into rural communities, is there a desire for that? Is it just you going into the rural communities with other academics? Do you have a larger team of other people who are helping make these connections? What is that?
It's usually, like with me, it's very grassroots. And so I've usually, the program that I'm involved with at St. Mary's, I started with my colleague because both of us came from that place, from rural Cape Breton. And so when you go home and you go into schools that you came out of, the students, they're really keen. And what I've noticed, the young women are particularly interested to hear what I was able to do, because it's like they're looking for someone to say, you can do this too. Like we had a really interesting conversation with a group of students at one of the schools. So we spent 2 years in each school in the county. And I had a really interesting kind of opening session with the students, and they were all talking about what they wanted to do at university, and all the young women started saying nursing, nursing, nursing. And then one woman said, well, I'm really interested in babies, so I'll do nursing with small children. And I said, well, what about being an obstetrician? And then she was like, oh. And so, but when you come from a place where it's not common, or you come from a family that you don't have doctors in your family, it's not something that maybe you see that you can do. And so it just takes someone saying, oh, well, you can do a PhD, and it's not a big deal. That makes a difference. Or you can be an obstetrician, get your marks up in science, and you can get in. So I think that's for that question. For the making space, it's trickier in research, I find, than in the other organizations that I'm involved with. The other organizations, we actually just say we are making space. So we are going to include a more diverse range of colleagues. We are actually going to reserve spaces because it hasn't been happening, and it's taking too long, and enough is enough. So it's actually easier, I find, in those organizations. In research, one of the real challenges is Indigenous colleagues, colleagues of color are asked to do so much now that you do not want to overload people with all of these requests. And so I find just building relationships and just saying I'm here, and then waiting for people to contact me and say, oh, I would like to do this. Or reaching out to people who I have a relationship with and just say, I think this would be really important for you to comment on, but no pressure. And sometimes they have the desire to do that and the time, and sometimes they don't. But I think making options available is important. Like, we still get books that have 90% male contributors. In my opinion, the editors have failed, because that says that they couldn't get a more representative group of scholars to contribute to a book. You know, when I review an article for publication and like 70 out of 73 footnotes are male colleagues, like, that's a problem. Like, these are big problems. And so just flagging these and actually saying this isn't acceptable, we need to make corrections, is important. Doesn't always make me the most popular person in the room. I'm tough. I can take it.
Any more questions? Yes, Dave.
He says quietly.
No, that's good.
Hi, no, so much there. It's great. I just want to got a little question really relating to some of the earlier part of the conversation, which I'm kind of interested in. And this relates really to the Irish and Scottish in the various theatres that you've been looking at, and the various settings that you've been looking at. And given the extraordinary prominence of Scottish migrants at all levels in Empire in the 19th century, and given a rather different place for Irish in the Empire, what I'm interested in is, can one track, let's say, Irish, be they Catholic or Protestant, who are in Scotland, being part of that Scottish movement? In other words, they carry a bit of multiple baggage with them abroad.
So migrants to Scotland and then secondary migration?
Second generation or whatever involved in Empire. Is there a story there? Maybe there isn't.
I think there is a story there, but I don't know it because I haven't tracked so much the secondary migration. I've tracked it from within a colony. So, for example, secondary migration within what would become Atlantic Canada. I see that, but I haven't yet seen Irish migrants in Scotland who, even in the next generations, but I haven't been looking for it. So that's a really good question, and I think there needs to be research on it. Thank you.
Joel.
Yeah, thanks so much. That was really interesting. I guess in what I'm working on, I'm looking more at the Protestant side of the process of colonization and empire and all those things. And so I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about how you do history when you're telling the story of, the colonized who become colonizers, just the complexities of that and the challenges of that, and just kind of how you do that.
How I do it. I suppose it wasn't planned, but one of the big changes for me, actually, that started that book was a friend. He used to be the keeper of the Scottish Catholic Archives, and he called me up, and he had just received a temporary deposit. A monastery, a Benedictine monastery, had closed just outside of Inverness, and its papers were being held at the Scottish Catholic Archives. And there was a diary in there of an assistant surgeon, a Royal Navy assistant surgeon, and he was a Catholic. And he's like, this is a really interesting diary, I think you should probably come down and see that. And so I went over, and that diary was a really interesting change for me in my thinking, because he was very clearly writing as an imperialist, as a participant in expanding the empire, but also at the same time reflecting on what it feels like to be like the only Catholic on a ship, or to be outnumbered within the medical service in the Navy. And then when you read more into it, you start to see this collection of people that he built around himself, which was a bunch of other Irish Catholic surgeons who were creating this network among themselves and going out into empire and doing their job, but also advancing their own careers. And so for me, I think doing it when you start looking at individuals and how they acted, and then in the archival work, you start to see more and more of that happening. That's one of the ways I do it. Your question is enormous, really. I mean, your question is my entire book.
Yeah. Well, it's like, there's this whole kind of animus to being Protestant and being patriotic about what the empire was doing. And so I think it's just that thing of, is it a thing of self-interest, or, pushing forward your own, and kind of, in Ireland, the period I'm looking at the end of the 18th century, it's Catholics are without political right. And so I think in seeing your work, it's tricky to kind of tell this story about people that are subjugated or oppressed, but then also in some cases go on to oppress others. So anyway, it's just
but they also, it's a really interesting exercise in agency, right? So people, it is for personal gain. It's because they believe in it. So for example, in the Highlands, after the Jacobite rising in 1745-46, and then the attack on Highland ways of life and living in the Highlands, there was a really strong military tradition in many of the families. And so that was part of how they were. One of the things that they really wanted back was this ability to contribute militarily to empire. And so they're actually arguing for that in the late 18th century, saying, we will raise regiments for you. Can you let us raise regiments for you? But Catholic relief doesn't come to Scotland until 1793, so much later than England or Ireland. It's not that they didn't want to participate. They did, and often it was to kind of reclaim this right that they actually felt they had. So it's really messy. But I think just because somebody is Catholic and somebody is Protestant doesn't mean that their motivations are fundamentally different. They celebrated the same things when it came to imperialism and empire, because they all saw themselves as part of enabling it. We, of course, have to deal with the consequences of it, but it was something that they all felt motivated for in various ways.
And I think one of the great things in Carly's book is you see all these, like a cynical or natural ability of Irish and Scottish Catholics to be able to present themselves as loyal, as like Catholics or extreme Catholics. They're able to show a different face to whoever they needs to see it in order to advance their and their community's interests, and that happens all the time in the book.
Yeah.
Great. I want to make sure I'm not cutting out any questions from our.
We don't have any questions, but we do have a comment, and it's just saying many thanks to all concerned for a very interesting discussion, and that's from Deirdre Doherty.
Okay, that's great, super. So I'm going to draw the event to a close, but before doing so, I want to thank our great Hub Events team, so Francesca and Aquila and everybody else, as always. And of course, I really want to thank Carly for giving us a brilliant career of your, a brilliant tour of your career and your work and how all those things intertwine with each other. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thanks everybody.